I'm very happy that Efrosini Protopapa has joined us, Director of Research at the place, artist. You just described yourself a moment ago to me as a practice research person as well, and also a friend. I think that's really important. I remember one of your projects a few years ago was called The Friend at Work, and I feel like this dimension of friendship is important too. So yeah, I'm very, very happy that Efrosini is here for this opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the interdisciplinary outputs that the experiences that we've had in this project and ways of thinking about that in the sort of going forward as well. And yeah, Efrosini has been, I feel you've been very like alongside us in this project and have been an observer and supporter along the way, which I'm super grateful for. And then, yeah, from this morning already, we've met Charlie Ashwell in your role as dramaturg on the first NEUROLIVE Commission detective work. And through that process, also a co-writer of one of the scientific papers about detective work, which we can talk about. And Laura Rai, who's also a member of the scientific team and first author of the EEG paper that you spoke about this morning. Hennie Lee, member of the scientific team and first author of the questionnaire paper about detective work that we spoke about this morning. And Guido, we know. We know you.
Great, and you can hear me okay? Yeah, great. Thank you for the invitation. And the other thing that Matthias didn't say is that I've kind of become a fan of this project, and one of the things that I've been mentioning to people involved is that I'm sort of always appreciative of the integrity of the different lines of inquiry and trajectories that people have been pursuing. And I guess one of the things I've probably been meaning by that is that there isn't a sort of a compromise in either artistic or scientific sort of ambition, rigor, sort of inquiry. And that's what it looks like from the outside. But of course, I'm sure there are challenges and sort of realities to navigate within that. And I feel that the sort of the topic of this panel will sort of touch perhaps upon some of these questions and conditions of the project. So we said the focus of the panel will be on interdisciplinary outputs, and already there's a lot to unpack within that. I would say sort of what I'm curious about, things that I'm sort of eager to unpack a little bit are things like what constitutes an output in projects like these, what forms does that take, how you work towards them, who are they for, where do they sit in the world, what do they do, and perhaps thinking about sort of research taking diverse forms, diverse approaches, but sort of this project bringing together quite largely diverse practices and interests and ways of writing or disseminating, sharing knowledge, which I guess is what the output, where outputs come in. So I wondered if we could start by you describing what you consider outputs as part of this project and how you would sort of describe them as, let's say, artistic or scientific or in other ways, hybrid or otherly termed. What are outputs that have kind of gone out into the world from this project? Some examples. I'll let you jump in whatever order.
Okay, I can start. So maybe I'll just start by saying what we wrote in the application, what outputs are. So in the application we wrote that we will publish, I think, 11 papers, and we would have 2 symposia, which are 2 outputs, and 4 live performances and 5 workshops. And we also specified that we think we wanted to have at least 2 conceptual papers, and the others were all empirical. And then we were also going to go to conferences. We've now got 2, which is not that bad actually. And I've sort of, airbrushed a few others to be fitting. But So that was kind of what was foreseen on the project to be the output of the project.
Can I ask you the difference between conceptual and empirical there?
Yeah, so something that is more theoretical about sort of what is liveness, so one question could be around what is liveness and how do our findings, what would be a scientific definition of liveness and what cognitive processes does it tap into? Or another conceptual paper might be around art-science collaborations. So those were the sort of two things I think I had in mind initially. Yeah.
I would like to add to that a little bit. So, I guess first of all, I always have a slight hesitation in relation to the word output. But if that is the language that we're within, then as you just said, Guido, as is already in the conception of the project, the commissioned performance works are themselves, are outputs in themselves, are bodies of research in themselves. And then I think something that wasn't so articulated sort of 5 years ago, or wasn't thinking about this, but at this moment in the project is very clear to me, is that what we also want to do is in the next few months I'm going to be creating a body of writing about the artistic research, which is drawing on the processes that I have been in with the commissioned artists, and also the ways of articulating their work that they have shared in the workshops last week and in the symposium this week. And so this, I guess that's a little bit different from the sort of categories of writings that Guido just mentioned, but also this account of the content of the artistic research feels like an important thing to emerge out of what has happened in the project.
I want to add a less official output, which I would say is like working relationships, as you mentioned before, friendships, dialogues with people, all of the conversations that we've had, all of the meetings that we've had. Matthias and I also started our paper writing process by dancing, and we would book space and dance for 45 minutes with no clear intention other than just to dance for 45 minutes. And then we would discuss and do some writing. So for me, those also have stayed with me, and they count for a lot, even if they're less visible at the end.
Maybe on similar kind of dimension from the scientific team is that, as Guido mentioned in the previous discussion as well, it was very challenging to be bringing all those measuring devices in the full performances, and working with the artistic team, and also just like I just think every single performance is like, if something went completely wrong, like no one would be surprised. Like it was a very high risk, I would say, of anything failing at any moment. And we had some like smaller failures here and there, technically, but like nothing, we actually didn't have any like collapse of like, so we actually managed to collect all these data. So I think, and that was possible because like we have also some of the RAs and additional research assistants who work with us, but it was just a very huge group effort, like at some point almost like 50 people working together for this technical side or the neuroscientific side to work. And we never really failed that much. In a way, I think could be like methodologically a scientific output as well.
Yeah, and also in addition to the papers or conferences, the actual data itself is an output that we plan to make open access, and other researchers can look at and research in addition to all of the code and the analysis scripts that we've used to analyze things in the papers that will eventually be published too.
And go ahead, you want to add something?
Slight expansions of some of those things I think are really worth saying. So the things that are not sort of named as outputs but that are really meaningful, just sort of to add on a little bit to what you were saying, Hennie, about this sort of methodological development and the kind of expertises developed within quite a large community. I just want to say something about the artistics, the way that expertise within the scientific team and the teams of research assistants really extends to the way that they have been holding the artistic side as well. So there are these layers of expertise around that which I think are important. And then it also reminds me of something that Kat Bridge said a few days ago about the importance of, very similar to what you said, about the sort of the human interactions and the human legacies of all the different interactions that have occurred in different moments of this project, which I feel is really important as well.
And would you say these are interdisciplinary, or in what ways are these outputs interdisciplinary in the sense of working across sort of disciplines or in between, or is the project interdisciplinary but the outputs sit more comfortably within the space of a more differently defined disciplines?
I think all the outputs are interdisciplinary. So even for the purely scientific papers, there's at least Matthias who will read through them and work with them, and at some point so they're always this sort of co-authorship, which is more common in the sciences than it is in the humanities. It allows us to sort of incorporate, but also acknowledge sort of the different contributions of people in the work. So even, I think it's a graduate, so even, I think there are probably, I'm not sure if they're purely artistic outputs, I guess that's the question. But from the scientific side, I'd say there are no purely scientific outcomes. So everything has had a contribution from the artist in one way or another.
John,
the tennis. The tennis.
Team artists in science.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess for me, yes, everything does have some interdisciplinarity, and the different things to different degrees. There's definitely something about the sort of when you think about sort of what audience is a particular thing facing, that can be telling an interdisciplinary story to a not so interdisciplinary audience sometimes. So in that sense, sometimes they're more disciplinarily focused. We also always had the intention, was always very important, that the artistic works would stand up in an artistic field. So they can stand up in that way, but then also to different degrees they are centering interdisciplinarity as a subject sometimes. But yeah.
From the perspective of the choreographic work, I would say that it can be considered a non-interdisciplinary output, I guess, in that, as you were saying, you can see it as a world in itself that doesn't interact with the scientific side, doesn't need the scientific side. I mean, you could question whether it even needs an audience. Maybe that's a bigger question. But when I think about like the event of the performances, obviously the space as a whole is extremely interdisciplinary. There's a lot of kinds of knowledge flowing this way and that. But sort of at the center, there's like the dance work happening. Then there's the layer of the audience receiving and interpreting the dance work. And then really spatially, there's another layer on the outside of all of these amazing scientists running around and panicking and whispering. And those layers are pretty distinct from each other, I would say, in the moment of the event itself. I think later in the consideration of the data that came up, how the data relates to the artistic material, then there's some movement across disciplines. I think that's how I see it.
Yeah, maybe I would challenge that slightly in the sense that, I mean, not that the artistic output is interdisciplinary, but the experience of the audience member who comes to the show is, well, at least some of the experiences I've had are very much that I'm coming to a performance / scientific experiment. Like I'm an interdisciplinary audience member, like I'm attending to this as a participant in the experiment and an audience, but I'm not the same as I would be as an audience member to a different type of show. So for me, the presence of the equipment and the running around, I'm not like looking at the running around, but I know it's there. I mean, I'm also slightly more informed, but I would argue most audience members sort of tend to be informed nowadays because they will look things up before arriving somewhere. So yeah, I don't. It's an interdisciplinary space, and the offer looks like it's doing different things or it's working in different disciplines, and that makes you a different type of audience member too. I wonder if that is the case also for the reader of the scientific paper, whether they feel, oh, I'm not reading this as I'm reading different type of scientific paper, or it's like kind of slightly testing me as a reader scientist. What do you think?
Well, with our experience with getting the EG study of detective work published, we went through like an 8-month review process with 2 rounds of revisions, and initially 4 reviewers, and obviously it's anonymous, so we don't know who the reviewers are, we don't know what their backgrounds are. You can recommend reviewers, but obviously they want the reviewers to be impartial, so the editor is also likely to select some reviewers for the manuscript, so it's very hard to know what background they're coming from. And I think, yeah, in our case we had quite a mixed reviewer response to the paper, in that 2 reviewers were happy after the first revision. However, the other 2 had gone back and picked up on some of the other reviewers' initial comments and said that they weren't happy. So it was kind of quite I hadn't experienced that situation before with other like papers that might be a bit more straightforward in terms of a traditional experimental design that is tried and tested, and you know, people know what to expect, and yeah, maybe it's, yeah.
This is the engaged and confused paper?
No, so that's the EEG one, yeah.
Okay, and this is for, can you share the journal title and the kind of...
So that was Delta Band Synchrony Predicts, was it?
Delta Band Audience Synchrony Tracks
engagement with live and recorded dance.
Can you share a little bit what the concerns were, or what were some of the things that maybe reviewers weren't convinced about so much? Or
so what were the concerns? So basically in that paper we included a number of different conditions of detective work. So we had the live performances, and we had the lab-based experiment where individuals watched the recording of the performance. So we were making arguments around liveness and what makes live experiences special. But one of the control conditions that we would have liked to include was the cinema experiment. We had some data quality issues with the cinema experiment, which meant that we couldn't run the exact same analysis on that particular experiment in the same way that we had done with the live and the lab-based performance. So of course, for a reviewer and someone who's, you know, a psychologist or someone used to conducting experiments, the obvious thing is just run another one of those experiments, and then you'll have everything you need to make a fully factorial comparison. And we did do another experiment, but we unfortunately encountered another technical issue, unfortunately, which meant that we still couldn't do that analysis in the exact same way. So that was one of the criticisms. I think that was probably the main one in the end. But
I guess another thing that comes up, which is sort of broader, is that you get from when you, so there aren't any artists on these pens, they don't send it out to people who understand what they're doing, and we do provide links to the videos and to the documentation and everything, but you can sense from the reviewers that they have a very specific conception of what dance is, which they bring to their reviews. So they say like, isn't this all music? Or this is just because it's the same stimulus, that's about all it is. And then when we write in the text, well, the movements are sort of, it's not structured improvisation, so they're actually different. And the movements aren't in line with the music. So it's, you know, like one thing alone can't explain it. And that's sort of a conceptual reason why that explanation of that reviewer doesn't hold. But it's very difficult to make that point because they just don't quite get that. You know, so it's like, well, what is it then if they're not dancing to music? Well, what are they doing then? So it's a little bit of that which you then can't counter in like 5,000 words, you know, sort of like you almost have to say, okay, you need to go back to something and explain something for which there is no space in this particular journal. So I like to say it's a little bit like doing sort of dance and neuroscience is a little bit as if you study face perception and you first need to explain everyone what a face is. You know, so that's sort of a little bit, I think it's an analogy that works for me. Yeah. But Engaged and Confused was very different.
I was going to ask about the process of publishing that. That's the one I've engaged with more, and you shared some of the findings there. That's for a different type of journal. It's aesthetics, psychology.
Yeah, that is called
Psychology of the arts and psychology of the aesthetics, creativity and art. And the arts, sorry. I just know it as that. Yeah, so I was first author and co-author with Charlie on that paper. And we did go around, we did go through one round of revision. So we also had 3, I think, reviewers. And I think they were a lot more respectful of the potential complexity that was coming in, because still it is a psychology journal, but they specialize on like art experiences and aesthetic experiences. And I think perhaps maybe Charlie can comment on this and Matthias, but the one of the reviewers kind of bringing on that the qualitative thematic analysis was done by the dramaturg of the piece, and they were questioning whether does that mean they're too close to the piece, and like could you have invited another expert to do that I think I just remember that review. That was one of the points Yeah,
I was meddling with was this on still? Yeah. I was there kind of infecting the data with my bias, my artistic bias. But maybe I could quickly summarize, from my perspective, the process of writing the paper. So basically the first thing I did was collect from Goldsmiths a pile like about this high of audience questionnaires. And I spent, I don't know how long, weeks and weeks and weeks, transcribing the audience's written descriptions of what they remember happening, which they had sat there and written straight after watching the performance. So as soon as the performance finishes, they start the questionnaire, which asks them all sorts of things about how happy they feel and things like that. And then at the very end, there's a very open question that just says, what happened? And anything that's stuck in their memory. And so I spent weeks, and it was a very surreal process as a dramaturg, because I obviously know the work inside out at that point. I've seen it dozens of times. And then to sit there and read some people's very detailed descriptions or very creative interpretations of what had happened. And then many people also just like wrote, I have no idea. In fact, that was the very last questionnaire that I transcribed. They just wrote, I have no idea, which I actually loved, because I thought maybe ultimately I have no idea what happened either. And then, so I was invited to make my own, I guess kind of recognize patterns in what I was reading, and just to comment on those, to describe those patterns that I saw coming up. So I wrote a bit about different ways that people were writing about what happened. So as we heard from Hennie before, that people would sometimes write just in very factual, almost empirical ways of, you know, there was a lot of repetition, or they wore green suits, very kind of direct experience. And then some of the writing was very poetic, very fabulatory, very imaginative, in ways that made me feel like the work was almost continuing through the kind of creative descriptions of what people wrote. And then, yeah, I made a few comments on the moments that stuck out in people's minds, and also the way that the work kind of came up against people's, they had an experience that their understanding was limited, and that their understanding wasn't great enough to know what happened. Yeah, that's basically, and then from there was also some scientific interpretation.
So yeah, some of what you're describing is sort of an attempt to introduce the disciplinary conventions or understandings to the other discipline in order to kind of arrive at some findings that may be useful across, or borrowing methodologies that are slightly different to yours in order to then understand something of what you're doing. So, like, in terms of you as researchers, what have you maybe gained, or is there any interest in doing that sort of shift slightly? Because I imagine it's easier and more straightforward to just work within your discipline with the conventions you know, and the methodologies you know, and the languages you know. So how is this informing you as researchers?
Sorry, I know I just spoke, but for me personally, I would never go through a process of kind of writing from data, of kind of collecting data, even though it's kind of creative data in a way. That's not, as an artistic researcher, that's not my practice, to sort of collate data and then make an interpretation. I'm rather more used to sort of putting concepts out there and then seeing what they do in the world. But this was almost the opposite of that. So for me, it was just an interesting challenge, and also interesting that I also didn't get challenged that much from the scientific, that it was all kind of embraced, and also from the reviewers. You know, apart from the fact of me being the dramaturg, otherwise there wasn't really much comment on, like, well, what do you mean by fabulatory, or anything like that. Like, there was an acceptance of that kind of language, which was really nice.
I think just to perhaps explain about the Engage and Confuse paper. So there are more recently in the psychology and cognitive science publications, they do this thing called mixed methods, where they show analysis of both quantitative and qualitative in a way that's what the approach we took. But I think the main differences are, even if you read those mixed methods papers from the scientific journals, they often, after the qualitative analysis, they still quantify that, and then they, a lot of the focus is just still on the quantitative analysis of the qualitative outputs, if that makes sense. And Engage and Confuse didn't really do that much, rather than again, the reviewers also, and hopefully the readers, have completely embraced all the themes that were discussed by Charlie. And then we kind of like had that in parallel with the quantitative analysis. And then we just simply found links or things that were mapping out to one another, rather than collapsing that again into, well, I mean, that may have been done at different stages, but not within this paper. So I would say, even within the kind of mixed methods papers, I think this might read a bit differently to the readers.
I think I can try and say something about your direction of questioning, but I might have to go a little bit back because I have, weirdly, now I have a bit of a history of scientific publication. And so that comes from the first sort of formal research collaboration that Guido and I did. So the first grant, predecessor to NEUROLIVE, was a shorter grant about synchronous movement, and it was an 18 months project. And so 2 or now 3 papers have come out of that. And so I've kind of got used to this thing of like that I do what I think is continuing what I do, but one of the ways that this ends up is that I end up as a co-author of a scientific paper, and my my like title on the scientific publication is independent artist, unaffiliated independent artist. And I really like occupying this weird position, and and so that then continues with NEUROLIVE now. I think what's really important to me is that for me it links a lot with my interests in epistemology and in the sort of these kinds of choreographic practices, including the ones that I'm involved in, are ways of knowing, and that I really understand them as forms of research. And so I like the fact that they can be interwoven into situations that are very strongly socially recognized as research artifacts. And so I say, yeah, this does live in this world as well. And I like that. That aspect of it is important to me.
Can we then maybe spend a little bit more time in this idea that you propose that is around, so there are different ways of knowing, you all come to knowledge or generate knowledge in different ways with your different methods, tools, backgrounds. And so what are the languages that you tend to use, or what kind of languages serve you in the way you're trying to share that knowledge? It's about, previously you mentioned something around credibility, like the reviewer wanted to know that these are the findings, or you're too involved in the work, so there's not this distance, objective way of knowing. So what then language do you use? How do different sort of ways of sharing the knowledge that you're generating reflect your methodologies and sort of the epistemological sort of grounds that you're working with?
I can continue a little bit and say a little bit about that, because I guess I am someone who is quite often in the middle. I am in terms of pieces of writing that get generated, both on the artistic side and on the scientific side. I'm sort of bridging a bit between the languages, and I guess sometimes things stick out, where sometimes it's clear that things are not translating, or need to be translated further from one audience to another, or where there are different sets of expectations, where the language carries a different resonance in the different contexts, and so that needs to be adapted. In general. And it also makes me think about one of the things that I think I quite enjoy about the engagement with, about my experience of engagement with scientific writing, is in terms of like languages that serve you, is that I think there is a practice in a sort of a culture of scientific writing that's about sort of like put it simply. I mean, things are often very highly technical, but then the story being told about that is put in you need to put it in very simple terms that can be understood, which is, and don't overcomplicate it. If you can say it more simply and more directly, just say it that way. And I think that there's less of a tradition of that, perhaps, in the in the humanities and the arts, sometimes, where language can be more, I don't know what the, the idea of like sort of art speak, I guess. The sort of like jargon-heavy language sometimes occurs, and I really like this idea of just like trying to say things directly.
Like maybe just to give a few sort of concrete examples of what that looks like. So I think across all the writings that sort of we do, there's sort of specific things that come up sort of when I edit things and when Matthias edits things. And it's always the same things that sort of we correct on each other. So there's the things, so one thing in sort of scientific writing that I think of and how I've learned it, and I guess how also sort of Laura and Hennie have learned it, is kind of like, use this creative, but it's not just simple, it's also sort of no metaphors under no circumstances, any sort of imaginary things, like you would never write, the delta waves look like. I mean, the wave is a metaphor, I guess. But even that I sort of take out, I sort of like delta frequency, sort of like delta wave is already for me, it's like, ugh, it's a bit too metaphorical. So if you try to sort of really describe, so I often sort of take out, and that goes to verbs as well, sort of like it's not, in many ways, scientific writing is not creative, it's a recipe. You just write, like you use the same words, this data shows that, this can be interpreted as, so you don't swap around, get creative with different ways of saying the same thing. You stick to the same thing of saying the same thing. So that's sort of one thing that sort of I often do. And I think one thing that Matthias often corrects then in our language is then, so what I'm obviously trying to do as a scientist, I try to draw general principles. So I write about detective work, and then I sort of write about dance is about mystery, and then Matthias goes back, that's not true, let's remember specificity, so then Matthias draws back and sort of often emphasizes that, sort of we need to sort of be careful with generalization, and I don't want to talk about all dance, I don't want to talk about all practices, and so there's a sort of quite productive tension in that sort of I pull towards, let's see how far we can like how much we can say, and let's not be too specific, because then it will be difficult to publish in scientific journals if I just say this only works for one work, but not for any other, then they go like, well, then come back when you've got more data, So I need to find ways of talking about mechanisms or principles that can sort of hold up to, that speak to more than one work. And that's sort of my job, without overgeneralizing and making claims that are a bit ridiculous, or like, or undermining the specificity of the artworks that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciated sort of in the presentations in the morning were very concrete in terms of describing this is where the audiences were, this is how long it lasted, X number of people, like 27, not around 30. And so that kind of language of, I guess, concreteness and specificity is very present. And also in sort of artistic inquiry and maybe writings that are led through practice, we might embrace the speculative sort of approach much more, or the writing through personal experience, which could only be mine and not universal. So I'm wondering there about those kind of values, or what sort of values are present in these different fields, and how have you navigated those, I guess, in this project, but also individually, because I'm very much aware that you also have the PhD postdoc journeys that are individual to this project, and I don't know how you have brought that kind of that work with you to this project. I don't know. Charlie, you strike me as somebody who very much kind of is trying to make a case for more speculative or less objective ways of knowing. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think your previous question about language has got me thinking about, sometimes there's a sort of claim that dance is this other way of existing that's not linguistic. But actually, I think in my work with Seke, in detective work in particular, I'm thinking about the ways that actually language is often there from the beginning, and it's about an articulation of an intention. And then the dance that happens exists in relation to that language, which in a way is very specific, and it is naming something and claiming something. And in the case of detective work, that was the intention to understand choreography as a process of creating and solving mysteries. So we sort of, from the very beginning of the process and throughout the entire project, and throughout the writing of the paper afterwards, I think I've had this in my mind the whole time. This kind of, I guess you could say it's a kind of a form of value, that, or a way of valuing what choreography can do, that it's a process of creating and solving mysteries. And that value relies on that use of language. And I think I was keeping those values in mind while I was interpreting the written descriptions. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Yeah, I just want to mention how I've known also about your work as a writer for a long time as well. Like, so I feel like you have just to mention that you have a history as an artist, a dancer and a maker, and a dramaturg, but also actually as a writer, and like, so it's like a really developed practice for you. Which I think, just so that it's very considered, I guess. That's what I mean. It's like part of your artistic practice. Yeah.
And here around language and sort of types of language you might have found yourself using in these outputs.
Yes, I think I was having a bit of confusion sitting here because I've been engaged mostly with this scientific type of writing the past 5 years, but before then I was so when I first encountered scientific writing, I just felt it was so relieving at some point. So I went to drama school, and for my bachelor's thesis, for example, I used a completely different language to what I'm using now. And I would say, personally, the first, my first attempt of scientific writing, so this was maybe before NEUROLIVE, I was a master's student at the course that Guido created. I remember Guido telling me, you probably forgot, but he was like, so Hennie, you basically want to write a recipe that anyone else can understand, and they can cook the same, they will cook the same thing and it will turn out to be the same thing. And I was like, okay, because in performing arts, like performance writing, you just never really have that sort of mindset. And then I just realized myself, like, yes, there was all this technical stuff about repeating the same words and then keeping things concise and all of that, but also just making sure whoever's reading this, they have potential to go do the same analysis themselves, and they should be able to do that. That's the job as a writer, scientific writer. And I think that has really, kind of, and I think now, now I think it's even changed. Like, for example, even if I write for my artistic project applications, I find myself, I'm distancing a lot more from the text and just kind of thinking a lot more from the readers. Like, I just want to be as clear as possible, and I think it's kind of being ingrained slowly in me. So that's been my experience.
Yeah, my experience has been purely in scientific writing, so I had zero experience of working with artists or any other discipline really when I came to this project. So in terms of like values, the goal or the aim is to like understand human behavior or to be able to predict it. And so the writing style is very much like operationally defining everything in your writing, so that's super clear. And the self or the I is to be removed from that style of writing. So even, like coming into like the workshops and everything, and the style of language was very new to me, actually. So yeah, it was a very different experience.
So there seems to be like a desire for the work to be repeatable or useful for others, or sort of claim some sort of truth or finding that if someone else was to do the experiment, it would be the same finding. We know this now. It's not going to change. This is what it is. And I'm worried slightly that we are also creating this such clear separation between scientific sort of purpose and artistic purpose. And I'm thinking of sort of practice research PhDs in the arts, where it's not exactly, you don't exactly create a recipe, but you are very likely to be asked, so what are you contributing to knowledge, and how is this useful to other practitioners in the future? And there are sort of probably many more ways in which these things are not as dissimilar as we are describing them. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, or if we can start to undo something that's some assumptions that we're maybe making around those binary ways.
Yes, I definitely don't see artistic research as at the extreme end of the particular that cannot be reproduced in any way or cannot be copied or repeated. In fact, one of my goals, I would say, in my artistic practice is that other people take the tools that I generate and try them for themselves. In my own practice, I generate a lot of scores that I call scores for watching, which are kind of different ways of working with the imagination as an audience member. And I just taught a week of classes a couple of weeks ago here, and I was really, really explicit from the beginning that I'm going to share a Google Doc with you that shares all of the tasks that we've done, and I'm very, very careful about how I put those tasks into language, and I choose the language in such a way that someone else could go into the studio and there's no doubt about what that would involve doing. There's a lot of doubt perhaps in what comes out of the practice, I would say, but the practice itself, I really value clear articulation and clear parameters. So perhaps that's something that we share. Maybe the difference is in I don't have any particular, maybe this is not a difference, I don't know. I don't have a prefixed goal in doing those. The clarity is in what the doing is. I don't need to know what the outcome is, actually. Maybe that's it.
Yeah, in terms of how I see the sort of, in my own artistic research, how I see the sharing of information, the contribution of the research to other practitioners, and how I see, I guess, influence, is, I guess, from my experience that there are, so my PhD is a choreographic work, and I don't expect that to be replicated. Okay, so it's not quite like that, but I believe that there are things about the work and the ways in which I speak and think about the work that can be nourishment for other people, like Siobhan Davis's term compost. That it's slightly more indirect, but that there are these forms of mutual exchange and this like compost nourishment. And I've definitely experienced that a lot from other artists. I draw a lot on the language of the choreographer Deborah Hay. It's like a very direct form of influence. I think about also the ways in which I've been influenced by the other artists who've made works in NEUROLIVE. I don't think that I am really fully sort of conscious of that, but I do remember, I think someone saying to me, I think it may be Katie Ko was saying to me last week in the workshop week about how she can sense some of the sort of resonance of some of the earlier works in NEUROLIVE in the work that I made in the final year. And like, I'm not sure I can really sort of process that consciously, but what I'm saying is that I think those kinds of less conscious and very kind of incremental kind of seepages are, for me, really important forms of influence, and are the sort of the real forms of influence in the context of my field. So it's about something different for me than replication.
Just to mirror sort of Charlie's point about that, sort of how artistic writing moves towards specificity in scientific writing, I guess from the other way around, it's obviously impossible. So one thing that I've learned, or in this process of artistic writing, or like in working with artists more generally, and that's something that I think science is starting to acknowledge better, is that it's obviously impossible to remove the I from the scientific writing, So if I always have to, I'm always writing as a person, we all have our backgrounds, there's a reason why, all the people on the team have usually an artistic practice of one kind, even if it's not directly related to the science, but practically that also means, so when I came, so two things I want to say. First of all, scientific writing is like the recipe thing is also often in mind bearing the fact that scientific writing is for an international community of mostly non-native English speakers, so it's like me, so English is my second language, not my first, so there's a simplicity that sort of also comes to the fact that we're writing for an international audience. And then the other part is that, what I noticed in my writing, when I came from Germany, I used much more passive voice with the desire to, it's like, I don't want to use we, I don't want to say I, but I think as I've sort of grown in my writing here, I've started to use not I, because that's too subjective. I'm not this is not my, but I'd use we a lot, sort of like we claim as the people, as the authors of this paper, sort of like as this collective who's been writing is, we think that, or we interpret this finding as. So I do use a lot more first person now than I used to, and I think that's partly because it just reads better, but also because I think it does implicitly acknowledge that, we are still scientists doing this work. And also, sometimes you can get into real sort of pit holes with the reviewers for current biology, for example, about like one word. We started off like interpreting these delta wave bands as collective attention, and there's sort of like pages and pages. You can't say it's collective, so you don't know if it's collective, and then we say, okay, can we say shared then? No, you can't say shared, so shared is not, and then so we removed it in the end entirely because it's just like, people just got too upset about it, so it's like, so there's also like, when we sometimes think of, sort of the humanities or arts being petty with words, scientists can do the exact same thing, so it's, and that shows you that, there's always the act of interpretation, obviously, always happens. The numbers need to be interpreted. And, so there is definitely a subjectivity that needs to be acknowledged in that process.
I just would like to say something that keeps bubbling up for me, which is almost like a, part of me feels like, oh, this is so clear that it doesn't need to be said, but I also just want to say this directly, that for me, in relation to this idea about the need for the removal of the I in a particular kind of understanding of research, that for me, what is again a really important affordance of embodied artistic research in a choreographic context is that there's an understanding that the research is happening. The research, there is no separation between the what is being researched and who is researching what is being researched. And yet, there is an ability to structure and carry out research. And so this kind of ability to be, to form knowledge generative practices that understand the oneself as inextricable from the situation, I think is a really important strength from my perspective of why this is important. I think that artists develop this ability.
Come to the audience in a moment, so please start thinking about questions. But this makes me think also about the working relationships and what you said earlier about, so it's the people who are involved in the research and the research that is happening are intertwined, and in this project maybe even more so. It's long integration. There's concrete teams who have been working on shows and writings for a long time. Part of the contribution that you are making is also like inventing these ways of working and these ways of sharing knowledge and sort of pushing at the kind of challenging languages, frameworks, audiences that might engage with this. Is that, do you feel that? Like, would you articulate it in that way, or are you kind of so involved in the activity that it's difficult to reflect on what you are, like, the meta contribution, which is about how this project is being done? Is that proposing anything in relation to interdisciplinarity, or are you discovering anything?
Yeah, that's quite intangible, but yeah, I hope that it does. I feel like that, those kinds of things, time will tell. That's how I feel. That's sort of. But I'm really, I definitely feel like over the course of these five years, we have built a community that will continue to exist beyond it, and there will be more from this community coming, and I hope that other people will pick it up as well. I would like to write about that a little bit more, which I haven't had time for at all. So all of these sorts of thoughts, I think they should be articulated on paper as well, like the stuff that we're talking about now. But I don't know, that's part of the thing. I don't quite know in which format or where or how, because also I don't have, so I know which scientific journals things go for. That's a sort of, that's a whole science in itself. To learn which research fits best within which journal and caters to what the editor wants, so if and I know that for sort of neuroscience, but I don't know that at all for within the humanities or dance research, let alone interdisciplinary works along those lines. Those journals don't exist, or maybe they do, but I don't know about them. Yeah.
Yeah, and you have your lecture performance coming up, so that's a kind of different type of output that you're preparing for. And you mentioned, Matthias, that you want to kind of do some further writing, reflecting on the collaboration. Are there more? My understanding is that there's a lot of data that is waiting to be analyzed. And that's also fascinating in terms of the kind of time that each type of research takes, and resource and sort of conditions that it requires. So if the artistic research has this kind of arc, maybe the science one, it could be that the next team after you put that up. Or I'm thinking of drug discovery, kind of goes 2 or 3 generations of researchers to arrive from beginning to finding. So what's next, or what other things are you hoping to put out into the world from this?
Do you want to talk about football?
Yeah, we proposed another study that we are yet to find out if it was funded, but it was to take the equipment out into a football stadium and investigate like crowd responses to watching live football matches. So position in the stadium, seated, standing, different variables like that. So that's one application. There's so many different ways the research could go, and there's so much stuff yet to analyze. So
I mean, that's a really interesting example because, we can do that and we want to do that, but it's also ultimately a way to just be able to continue that analyzing the data that we have, because we can't say, right, we need more time, can you give us more money for the same thing, sort of like it always has to be something new. So then you end up in this position that we think about something new that we can do, which allows us to do the stuff that we haven't done yet, So that's just sort of, you get into this cycle of applying for stuff that you've already done. Yeah.
Part of me wants to say, I don't know, and it's like, I think I get very, can't see the wood for the trees because we're so in the detail and have been, for now several years. But then for me also, I think that, I find it really exciting the way that artistic research is positioned amongst a sort of wider research culture in this project. And I am particularly interested in ways of knowing, and in a way I think it's what I'm interested in is very related to consciousness studies. So I have an interest in the future exploring the idea of positioning choreographic practice as a form of consciousness studies. And so that is a sort of potential future direction that I see, which is a little more sort of pointed in terms of the sort of positioning of choreographic research.
My dream would be to do a symposium with Matthias about magic.
Yeah.
But that hasn't even been discussed. Well, we floated the idea and Matthias was like, yeah. But I don't know how,
Shall we open up any questions or observations? I mean, also you can ask each other questions if you haven't had a chance.
Hi, thank you. That was a very cool conversation. I had this question floating around since the beginning, and I think you partly answered it. But there is this idea of like the scientific team and the artistic team, and maybe to like the outputs on the scientific side would be like scientific papers, even though they have some taint of like dance and artistic work, and maybe on the artistic side it's workshops or writings, but also more in artistic spaces. And I was wondering if you just if you had ideas of outputs that could be like in the middle, that could take like a new shape or new form, a bit to illustrate that idea that you said that this is a world in itself. And I was just wondering about like new forms of outputs that could be in the middle and illustrate that interdisciplinary work.
That's so great. That's so great to sort of invite the space for that. I'm not immediately sure kind of like how to do that or what that would look like necessarily. In a way, I feel like it makes sense to me that you have to hold a context for that, which like that's what this is right now, I think. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's great to keep imagining, and also that the kind of like you were saying, the sort of community that exists, I think, is an important kind of ground within which that can kind of ferment. I think the spaces have to be either found or created.
I just wanted to underscore a couple of things that were said. So I think in terms of language, I feel like, and I think this was said, but with detective work, all of the choreography started as language. So it's like me proposing something for me and Steph to do, or for Jamie, the composer, to do through me speaking. So I think that's, and I would say not all dance is created like that. So it could be that I, had come in and made lots of movement material and taught it, which I think is that's not coming through language. But they were generated through different kinds of instructions, verbal instructions. So I think, don't know, just thought to just underscore that point. And the other thing, in terms of the relationship between the choreographic research and the scientific research, I think, it's good to be clear that, like, I was saying this morning, it wasn't that Guido was saying, oh, it would be great if you can have some unison, or a bit where you smile would be really interesting, or could you do these sorts of arm movements, like that, or green might be an interesting colour for certain parts of the brain. So it wasn't that at all. There was no restriction in that way, but we were in dialogue the whole way through the process, also in terms of how the experiment was going to be set up. And there were things that we tried. So we tried on the scientific measuring devices and decided not to use them. And there was questions around blackouts and lots of, so there were a lot of things that, and I think I would have, if I'd made the piece in a different context, I would have made a different show for sure. So I think, I just wanted to sort of clarify that, even though it wasn't a kind of like micromanaged process where I was delivering something to fulfill a brief. There were a lot of factors that influenced what we ended up doing.
Thank you. It's really relating to what you asked, because I was really thinking around the similar. And so your project is somehow interdisciplinary. The word was used as interdisciplinary. And there are cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary. And also relation to collaboration. So I think the dance, how I understand, I'm not from dance background, so it is multidisciplinary in a way. One way is because the dancers, choreographers, dramaturg, the lighting, the costume, logistics, they all stand as their professional expertise. So they work together, collaborate together towards the one goal. And then that's probably, cross is only, I'm also interested in the word, but also I have to say I actually hate the word discipline, because that's, in my mind, that's blocking our oneness. That's blocking how we can even operate within the same field or artistic merging or really understanding each other. And that's kind of siloing the world into different, of course these are necessary, but I was also wondering this new genre, the trance, how I read, is that the trance is when these different expertise, if I don't say the word discipline, create new status or new planet, maybe, I don't know, so that it's no longer separate. It becomes one, and then project or proposes something new world making. And I was wondering if, this further ahead, if the trance is coming, and also in relation to language, I feel language is not only words. How we are sitting is also language. So that especially in performing arts, the language of the body is similar to verbal language, I feel. So that this was so much in all the 5 works, that it's sort of intertwined, interwoven in many processes. So it's
Yeah, I sort of feel the desire to slightly push back and do something, in sort of appreciation of disciplinarity, because I think disciplines often come. I mean, they're not necessarily something that is imposed. I think certainly in the context of science or cognitive neuroscience, they come from a history of establishing and improving, the agreed. The agreed ways in which is the best, in which we can sort of make sure that stuff is replicable. So it's sort of like the conventions. That was about. So the conventions of scientific writing are themselves the process of hundreds of years of what is the best way of doing science that allows us to replicate things? And there's, science goes through crisis. The research one was what is called a replication crisis, where it sort of became clear that all these findings that had been done in the 70s didn't actually hold up if they were done again. And then from then on, there follows new conventions about publishing whole data sets and publishing code. And there comes a sort of specificity and disciplinarity then from that is on the other side then more difficult to just tap into, because it's itself so developed and requires so much expertise in itself. And I think artistic work, you can think of it in the same way, sort of the disciplinarity of artistic work also comes from the fact that there's an incredibly long history of expertise and practices in one area, and it's just very difficult to do, if you just do that, you have enough on your plate,
Of course, I'm not...
Yeah, so no, it wasn't in position, I just, to say, so I guess, I really like, I do interdisciplinary work. I really like, and that's sort of what I try to, I guess, quite actively push as well, So, but I think why I'm sort of tending, I think I have a reflex, which probably too much sometimes, to sort of try to publish our work in the disciplinary journals, in the best ones in their disciplines, because I feel even if I have to compromise or twist the story or tailor it to that journal, if it gets in, or if it sort of gets there, its impact will be bigger and it will change the understanding within that discipline more than if I sort of do a sort of more hybrid format that doesn't quite speak to those specific audiences. But I'm very aware that requires, you need to chip away from, you need to compromise, or it's difficult, maybe compromise isn't the right word, but you need to shape it very specifically and you need to leave things out. Yeah.
Can I add to that from the artistic perspective? I think for Matthias and I would say probably all of the artists who've contributed to NeuroLive, we might consider ourselves as working at the edge of a discipline anyway, and so speaking for myself, I find it extremely important to claim a position within a discipline, precisely because from a more mainstream perspective, the kind of thing that I am invested in might not seem like a typical way of doing that discipline. So it's a bit of a strategy. It's also a way of connecting the past to the present, thinking about the future. And I suppose the kind of prefix inter, for me, it suggests that you can both take a strong position within a discipline and also speak to another discipline at the same time without that being a compromise. I enjoy that. But I also sort of enjoy speculating about what you're suggesting, and I wouldn't do it myself, but maybe there's a world in which that could happen where all disciplines fall away. But I think that would require really particular conditions and particular values of everyone involved to just sort of discard everything they know and the ways that they know it and create something brand new together is also exciting.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful for me. But I'm not saying that these disciplines are useless. I mean, all the histories and amazing endeavors and discoveries and everything is so, that's how we are here now. But so based on, I think it's what you also mentioned about the influencing the particular areas from a new perspective is really, really amazing. And that's how we don't come out of our own disciplines, but I think this work is the beginning of seeing the world, not perceiving the world, not working in the world, so that we can enter or cross or trans.
I just wanted to say that I think from my perspective, also through the experience of this project, I think it feels really important to sort of retain your grounding in your field of practice, but then at the same time to be kind of overlapping in places. So I think there's a sense for me in the NEUROLIVE project of the choreographic practices and the cognitive science practices of trying to stay really full in themselves, but also meeting and overlapping to different degrees at different times. And the other thing it makes me think about is just that I think I have an understanding which is very influenced by Siobhan Davis of dance as a space, this building, this room as a space where different disciplines and different ways of thinking, different forms of curiosity come together. So it feels very sort of natural for me to think about dance as a host for different forms of curiosity and different forms of knowledge. So it's quite sort of immediate for me somehow.
I was sort of been chewing over this thing about outputs a little bit, and there's a conversation around language, and I was I think perhaps something I feel like I may have observed in some of the different works that have been part of this process is, in a way, one of these overlaps all coming together to birth something a little bit new or nuanced in relation to language that might be practical and of necessity within the performance context and the experimental design of the scientific research that's happening within these performance situations, where maybe something is necessitated, like communicating to an audience about doing the resting state, but how there was this kind of evolution or collaboration around how that languaging happens, what's specific about that and needs to be there, but the kind of tone of that and how it sort of fits in or meets both the scientific necessity and the artistic aesthetics or tone with specific to each of those performances, which feels, notable.
I think that's such a good example of this, I remember those moments a lot. I think that's it. So, thanks for saying that.
Any more questions, final thoughts?
Basically, I'm going to tap into language as well. Mostly scientific writing to begin with. I find it incredibly dry, and I do scientific writing. I do write it, but I think sometimes it does lack an ability to transfer exactly what the thoughts are, especially in the beginning when you're stating what the concept is and how you're going to go into measuring and all that. I agree that it always has to be a recipe. There's always has to be a way to communicate in a way that another person can replicate, but that's more into the methodological front, if that makes sense. But when you're trying to go into conceptualizing what you're studying, what you're doing, it could even start from a metaphor, and I think that should be accepted within the scientific sort of writing community as well. And it's something that I've started to pick up on once I started my master's, which was a bit more interdisciplinary, and I really wish to continue because it makes the work more interesting to reach out other audiences, even if it's within, let's say, scientific journals. And it also makes it a lot more easier to understand, because even if it's within a scientific community, there is many times where I come across papers where I'm like, so what do you mean? Like you go upon like a big jargon-like world where things can't really be explained in a way that is simple, really. They try to simplify things that are not. And I think this kind of work allows for that space of like being a bit more creative in certain aspects of the scientific writing, which for me I find fascinating. But yeah, just wanted to say that this conversation sort of sparked this thought. Yeah.
Yeah, just jumping off of that, what's coming up for me, and going back to the dissemination of knowledge and knowledge production, I think something that is really generative about this process is that it pushes against the privatization of knowledge, right, within university contexts, institutions. And I guess one thing I'm curious about, specific to the languages, it seemed like there was a push and pull between universalizing, but also specificity. And I would just like to hear about like the level of sacrifice that you had to experience on both sides. Sorry.
I mean, I would like propose terms like the in fact and the as if as sort of ways of thinking about the difference between the descriptive and the imaginative. And then Guido would be like, just call it the descriptive and the imaginative, and then Matthias would save me. So there was like the threat of culling, of sacrificing, and then there was my savior. So yeah, it was nice to witness that back and forth and not have to. I mean, I also don't feel too precious about language. Like I'm up for just trying stuff and adapting to context. And this was a context that I'd never written for before. But yeah, also grateful to Matthias for standing by these things that I invented. Yeah.
You brought this specific example up because as I was reading Engage and Confuse, it's between two dashes and it says da-da-da, in fact. And I went back and was like, what does this mean? And I read it again. I thought, is there a comma before the in fact? So it's not like the expression in fact, it was more like in actual fact, this happens. This is the description of the thing. But it was like a small kind of alienation for me as a reader. I mean, I don't read articles in that particular journal. And so, because I was reading, I was like, this is a very strange way of describing this. And I went over that line a couple of times.
And then you realized it was me.
No. So I think there is something about the conventions of a piece of writing and the reader who is coming to that writing with certain expectations, familiarity or not with that language, and then like how you've worked around a language that describes, basically, but does it slightly differently is also kind of, it wakes you up as a reader, and I really valued that moment. Yeah, because I wouldn't expect that to be described like this. Yeah.
I think just one thing that I think is really important is, and that I really insist on all the time, is that when we're writing about a work, like say the papers that have already been published about detective work, I think it's really essential to include the artist's own ways of speaking about the work at some point. So it doesn't mean that, it just that somewhere in there is the artist's way of speaking about the work.
Thank you very much, everyone. I know it's the end of the day, and some people have sat on 2 or all of the panels together, so thank you very much for keeping the thinking going, and everyone for your very kind of provocative sort of questions. It's opened up lots of thoughts that I think will come back in the next few days. I think there's something else, or interdisciplinarity, and yeah, more works to be discussed as well, which I think dealt with some of these issues slightly differently, so I think that will be also good to reconnect to. Have a good evening. Thank you. Anything you want to say?
I want to say thank you. Just thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.